Welcome everyone and thanks for coming. This is another talk from a series of undisclosed locations. It's the second of 4 events hosted by the Information and Interface Design course at London College of Communication, renamed to User Experience Design 2 years ago. So this is the third graduating cohort of the entire course. And year on year, we see an increasing diversity of projects that are defining the breadth of possibilities for interface and UX design as a discipline. So the teaching team has continuously wrestled with what the best definition for the course is and the most effective description. But there is no real single agreed upon canon, nor a well-defined list of characteristics that make the ideal practitioner in this area. Its legacy is very broad in that it comes from arts, social sciences, and engineering. And even the industry, which our students are about to enter, are equally confused and ambiguous about what terms like user experience designer means. There should in fact not be a direct link between a course and a job role, since those jobs are often precarious and temperamental, and increasingly so. But this is an opportunity and challenge for our students to define what a practitioner can be in this area, and not with a list of skills and software, but through more substantial characteristics. So this year we continue to see students forging a path through an extremely challenging year and demonstrating the depth of those characteristics in ways such as curiosity and depth in their research, their substantial critical thinking and the willingness to challenge the given doctrine. Seeing how the material of design connects to the social and the cultural, and finding new ways of understanding and communicating complexity. And finally, this year in particular, the adaptability and determination of the graduating students has really substantially impressed me. So these behind the interface talks are an opportunity to see more of these characteristics than their interfaces that they've designed and built allow alone. And it's one of our ongoing challenges at graduate showcases, how to show the intangible and non-visual components that represent a large share of the students' work, i.e. their research, their process, their conceptualizing. So really what's behind their interfaces. And this is a series of talks that will allow those students to dive into the nuances of their outcomes, their thinking and their process, and show the depth and energy that they have applied in their final year. So without further ado, I will shortly pass you over to our graduates for the first series of talks. So our first presentation is going to be from Kristina Iankova. Her project, Journey to the Center of the Internet, looks at the ways that metaphors shape how we understand and interact with the internet.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Christina and my project is about internet metaphors and how they affect how we perceive and interact with the internet. First, I'll be giving you a guided tour of the animation I created, which I adapted for this talk, and then at the end I'll show you photographs of the outcome in its original intended context. That said, let's get going. The internet is everywhere, but it's also invisible. Not only in the sense that it's impossible to perceive binary flashes of light, but also because its physical infrastructure is often hidden in the urban environment, out of sight, out of mind. It's become such an ingrained part of our everyday lives that we are more likely to notice it when it stops working than when we're actually using it. To combat this invisibility and make it easier to navigate, we employ metaphors, such as a cloud or an information superhighway. These metaphors help us navigate the web by comparing it to a physical space, taking away the need for specialist language and making it easier to communicate complex and often abstract ideas of how the network works. But these metaphors, they don't exist in a vacuum. They guide our imagination about a new invention and can influence the shape of what it becomes. This is where it gets interesting, as no metaphor can give a perfect representation. In each metaphor, certain aspects of a technology are highlighted, whilst those that aren't consistent with the metaphor are downplayed. And it's in this way that the choice of metaphor can reveal the intentions of both those who use them and those who design them. As technology advances, judges and regulators often have to think about whether new technology is significantly like an existing thing that we already have laws about. And this is where metaphors can become a contested domain of political action. Is the internet like a utility for the purposes of protecting net neutrality? Is a website like a hotel or restaurant so that it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities? Is data and metadata our personal property? We've arrived in cyberspace. Cyberspace is one of the most prevalent metaphors for describing the internet. Imagining it as a space or a collection of places. One theory for why we do that is because the concept of space is so important to language in general, we use spatial metaphors to compensate for the internet's lack of tangibility. The term cyberspace was first used by sci-fi author William Gibson in 1982, who described it as a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators. This was an apt prediction of what evolved to be the internet. Nowadays, services such as online banking are functionally the same as going to a physical bank. Our reliance on linguistic metaphors is further highlighted as we go to meetings, visit websites, and surf the web. During coronavirus, a lot of us partook in virtual pub quizzes, the name of which had us imagining a certain atmosphere and an energy that we brought to them, which would not have necessarily been present if it was just called a quiz with friends. The pub is created within the group's collective imagination. However, this metaphor also has its downsides. It implies a lawless, limitless, borderless space because it consists of addresses between machines, right? However, it is policed like everything else. And despite being belongs to the early 90s, it has been constantly used by politicians as they attempt to apply property and territory-based laws to it. For example, at a cyberspace conference in 2011, David Cameron remarked that we can't leave cyberspace wide open to criminals. So while this metaphor is beneficial for lawmakers, it does not necessarily best serve the public in maintaining an open and free internet. Moving on, we examine the cloud. The new metaphor for our age, rather than acting as a container or a place, the cloud is an amalgamator. Content resides somewhere off any individual user's personal device and is accessed with almost no knowledge of where the server holding its content exists. It's silent, in the background, and almost unnoticeable. The cloud is perhaps the most contradictory internet metaphor. Where it portrays itself as natural and transparent, it's actually hugely opaque, hiding things behind its friendly user interface. For example, the ever-increasing amount of electricity that's required to power its data centers. These data centers are also placed in strategic legal and regulatory locations such as Ireland or the US, allowing multinational companies to create a coalition of geographic areas that allow them to move capital and resources around. The lack of geography makes it hard for governments to regulate the cloud. For which country's policies should govern the use of online data collection, use, and manipulation? We give our data to these companies on the premise of ease, convenience, security, and yet we have very little control over it. Our data is subject to the whims of multinational corporations, meaning that we are surveyed by institutions we didn't elect from places we may have never physically been. Below the cloud is the global village. The global village is also from the late 90s and focuses on the relationship building aspects of the internet, such as connecting with others on social networks or joining online communities. The term paints a picture of closeness and interconnectedness one may find in a small village, but applied to internet users around the globe. Following the Cold War, the global reach of the internet was viewed with hope and optimism, because the internet was seen as an antidote to state power, both in its divisive and repressive capacities. The pervasive idea was that by connecting every person in the world, allowing them to interact on equal footing and freely express and discuss their views, this would result in the creation of a global polity marked by consensus, individual freedom of expression, and radical participatory politics. Contrast this with the present day, where the idea that the internet is weakening democracy is not uncommon against the public. Fake news, memes, targeted political advertisements all contribute to internet populism and increasing political polarization. Lastly, we come down to the information superhighway. Popularized by American Vice President Al Gore, the information superhighway is imagined as a network of super-fast roads rapidly transporting packets of information from A to B. It's useful for thinking about connectivity, speed, communication, charges, infrastructure, and an apt way to picture information as bits and bytes traveling down wires. America's original interstate highways were credited with creating American prosperity, and the use of this metaphor implies that large-scale investments in the internet will similarly benefit the common good. This metaphor's popularity tapered off in the early 2000s, but it actually resurged around 2010 with the development of net neutrality discourse. In 2014, Obama said regarding net neutrality that, quote, "There are no gatekeepers deciding which sites you get to access. There are no toll roads on the information superhighway. This set of principles, the idea of net neutrality, has unleashed the power of the internet and given innovators the chance to thrive." That concludes our journey to the center of the internet. Now I'll show you how this project was originally meant to be experienced. The project consists of a physical installation which includes this large blank television screen from which the viewer can hear a busy soundscape. Nearby, there are some glasses which they can pick up, and once they put them on, this allows them to see the animation we just looked at. Before that, the screen just appears white. The interaction with the glasses is crucial, as this allows the viewer to peep into a world that only exists in our imagination. Now, once they've looked at it, they may have a few questions about what it is they're looking at, which is why I made this guidebook to go along with it. The guidebook presents the research behind the project, as well as containing a map of the illustration. I chose to make it a map as it fits with the metaphor of going on a journey. The physical properties of the map, it being so large and clunky, also draws on memories associated with traveling. As a little extra, I also made some tickets, which would function as business cards. If you're interested in reading the full essay that is found on here, a PDF of the map is available on my showcase page. It's basically a much more in-depth and detailed version of the talk I gave today, going into further detail on each metaphor and things like that. So yeah, that's about it, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Christina. It's a really interesting project, helping us see how we use metaphors as a lens to understand the world around us and how they're absolutely replete on the internet. Please keep in mind, everyone, that Christina will be around for a Q&A after 2 more presentations. And next up, we have May Ellerman, who will be discussing her final major project, the research and process she went through, and talking about the importance of storytelling to a designer.
Hi everyone, my name is May Ellerman. I'm going to be presenting to you how I go about my projects, a little bit about my final major project, and the importance of storytelling. But before I begin, here's a link to my portfolio, and here's a link to my LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me, I'm sure I'd like to get in touch. Let's begin. Studying this course has encouraged me to think critically of design and how to produce projects that are meaningful to users. Within my work, I explore and present the social impacts of technology and culture through user-centered design. But before I begin any project, I create a brief. And this is the outline I follow. As you can see, there's a lot of questions, but it really helps. So in the context of my final major project, I wanted to understand how political conversations could be conveyed through clothing and understand a movement. So, originally from Sudan and a recent revolution that had happened, I wanted to study that a bit further. So what did I do? I followed these 7 steps. So I started off with research, asking questions like, what is fashion in politics? What is the national dress of the tour? Who are the users going to be? And what are the goals? I would then go on to document all my work on my blog, like the one here. I would then collaborate and build relationships, for example, with my lecturers, course mates, and potential users, create early lo-fi designs, and communicate my progress with also my lecturers and course mates. Feedback is crucial. I would iterate and test, and then I would create and iterate and test again. It's really important that you do this, because every time you do a user testing, you gain really valuable feedback. And you can either pick a new medium, test one out such as virtual reality like I did, but then realize later on that that's not the right medium. So why did I choose a video over virtual reality? Reason being was because it was the most appropriate medium for my second outcome of my final major project. Let me show you. Here it is. So Invisible Histories Woven was about discovering the history behind the national dress. Because there was a time when the designs of the material of the tour were named after social and political events that occurred in Sudan and around the world. And when women were silenced from participating in these political conversations, for example, they would design new fabrics that would signify a moment in history. So I realized the best way of showcasing this was to pick the most important tours, or the most worn till this day, and present them as a timeline in a video. And that was more useful than showing in a virtual reality experience. So why is storytelling important? It's a skill that is often underestimated, but as a designer it will help you frame your ideas better. And for the users, it helps them to become more engaged in the work you've done. So how do you gain the skill? Simple. You can just watch movies and read fiction. These days, even movies and books are becoming more minimalistic in their messaging. So this is a good place to start. But also remember, when playing games, there's always very strong symbolism and strong visual storytelling. They use symbols and backgrounds, environments to tell a story without words. I hope this presentation helped. Have a good day.
And that was Animoji May, who will be around for a Q&A after the next presentation. And up next, we have David Valente, who will be discussing a project from early in his third year on the course, where he created a tool to help people subvert online censorship by following a process of understanding how image recognition algorithms worked and offering people an opportunity to create new imagery using his tool.
Hi, I'm David, and around November time last year, I worked on a project about online censorship. To give a little context about the scope of this problem, here's two examples of non-Chinese companies operating outside of China to customers outside of China, but still bowing to the demands of the Chinese government. These are two fairly tame examples, but there is an endless list of this sort of activity since China started its war on information 23 years ago. And this illustrates the other end of the spectrum. So here's two burner accounts I made on Weibo, and I can send hi back and forth, and that's fine, but as soon as I drop the Tiananmen Square bomb, it doesn't even send a message, and it doesn't even notify the user on the other end that there was a problem or that the user tried to send a message. This is the egregious level of censorship that I want to combat with this project, and if nothing's done about it now in the next few years, we can expect this level of censorship on the social media apps that we use in the West. It's already happened with TikTok, which ByteDance claims is an American company, yet they still censor the Black Lives Matter hashtag. This is where my work begins, trying to sidestep and combat this type of censorship through creating methods and techniques to modify the content that we put online such that the platforms cannot read it and therefore censor it. On WeChat, at least, images are censored manually by people when they find one that they don't like. And the way they do this is by creating a hash for each unique image. And what this means is if you take an image which is censored on WeChat and edit just one pixel of it, it is therefore a new image. And you can re-upload it to WeChat and it won't be censored. But assuming it's going to get more sophisticated in the future, I began looking at techniques to modify images to confuse and trick computer vision systems. So I start with this work by Tom White, who is an artist who's done a huge amount of work in this space. Here's 3 images from him, and 2 humans. We obviously identify basically nothing in these images, but computers will try their hardest to identify an object. In particular, the one on the right, to a computer essentially looks like porn. So I can use this as a base to add something which is definitely not porn and try to confuse the computer into thinking it's something that is opposite. Tom uses Google and Amazon's computer vision systems when he's experimenting with his work. And since Google's one gives a lot of information for free, I use that for the duration of this project. So the first experiment I did was I took a meme and I fed it into the Google Vision API, and it wasn't very adult and it wasn't very racy according to the tool. The porn, it returned porn. And then when I overlaid the images, I successfully managed to confuse it in respect to what it thought the meme was. People who have done this type of work had found that inverting the image was very effective at confusing the computer vision. And something I want to highlight that Google has at least, and we have to assume that other companies have this as well on these social platforms that censor, is the ability to scrape the web and find additional context and more human detail about these images. So you can see on the left, it was able to pretty accurately identify the context behind this image. So this is clearly an image of the protests in Hong Kong from last year. And on the right, it essentially only saw water. And this works for pretty much any image. When you invert it, it becomes blue. However, this is a pretty poor viewing experience for humans. But this technique in particular comes with the distinct advantage that anyone on their phone can just download the image and using an app, invert the image again and see the original. Something in particular that's unique to the Google Vision API is that whenever it failed to identify anything in the image, it would just default back to packaged goods the vast majority of the time. So here's 3 examples. Now we can clearly see that that's not just packaged goods, but that is basically all that the tool returned. So I took advantage of that and just started giving the tool packaged goods. And this is what it looks like. I took the same image from before and put it on just a mock-up, and it couldn't find the porn that it found before when it knew how it should be laid out in the image. In the lower left that you can see is essentially the porn image in a sea of grey. So I just simplified this mock-up and gave it an image in a sea of grey, and I kind of hit the jackpot for this part of the project, where I could just take any image and give it a huge border, and this tool in particular would really struggle to identify what's in the image. So this is great for the computer because it can't understand it, and it's great for humans because it's a really good viewing experience. You just have to zoom in a little bit and you can see all the detail. There's one final technique that I've found to be pretty effective, and that's just adding another image. Now, this doesn't work with most images, but I found with strawberries in particular, and I have no idea why, strawberries are amazingly effective at just hiding whatever else you put in the image. So I kept that as like a contingency backup technique in this project. The way that text is censored is super basic. As long as the message that you send contains any term on the blacklist, the message gets censored. So here are the 4 techniques that I ended up with for how to combat this problem. Any technique which modifies the content of the string should work. So these 4 techniques work because they either edit a character or add an additional character within a term. My favorite technique out of all of these is adding thin width spaces, which is essentially just the same as space character but a little bit thinner, so you can barely see it and it just looks like poor kerning. And it's great because it's still really readable, but the computer won't recognize the term. And one really good thing about this technique is a lot of social media platforms won't even render it on screen. So here's Twitter, for example, and you can see on the bottom that those characters are part of that string, so you should be able to see small spaces within the words, but you won't see them on screen. And here's a couple of the techniques in action in Weibo. So So if you add a character into a censored term, it gets through. If you add a thin width space or any space in between two characters, it still gets through. But if you just type the censored term, it won't send the message. Finally, the interface that wraps this whole project together looks like this. It currently has text and images, which I've spoken about, but with room for expansion for links and videos. For text, there are 3 techniques for modifying the text, and if it identifies any censored terms within the text, it will, on the first click, uncensor that term and then continue to modify the passage of text in other random places. One extra feature that I built into this is the share button in the upper right for text, and what this does is it takes the string and it re-encodes it into base 64, which you could think of as super basic encryption, even though it's not. It just represents the text in a different way, and I add this to the end of a URL, and then you can share this link to anyone, and when they click it, they are shown this page with the passage of text that you wanted to show in the first place. Now, this is great because on one hand, they could censor the domain, so we could just change that. And if they discover that we're using base 64, then we can just encode it or encrypt the text in another way. Finally, images, which also has 3 techniques. So the user uploads an image and then chooses whichever technique returns the most inaccurate results for the image recognition predictions. And finally, I need to talk about some of the problems with this project. The first of which being, ideally, I would like to test images and text with a proper Chinese WeChat account, which I cannot obtain because I nor have a Chinese phone number or identity to sign up to the app with. I also can't test on someone else's existing WeChat account because that would seriously endanger a person or their family's livelihood. I tried and tested to get posts on Facebook removed because when I searched for users online to test this product with, I saw a lot of people on Facebook complaining about their posts being taken down, some of them just having a link to a news article. However, Facebook was too sophisticated for me to test with. And I couldn't get images censored on Weibo, even though text I could get censored. So that is why I had to resort solely back to the Google image recognition machine. And finally, the ethics of someone building or using a tool like this, because obviously any tool can be used for evil. And obviously this is a huge debate without an answer, but ultimately, if we don't try to fight evil, we will eventually succumb to it. And I think it's better to try and put more stuff out there and regulate it than put nothing out there and let those with power have control over everyone. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the other talks.
Thank you very much, David. So that's our first 3 presentations, and in a moment we're going to set up the Q&A with Christina, May and David. You hopefully have been sending questions into the chat window during the presentations because shortly we're going to relay those to the students and have a brief conversation. If you haven't done that, but you've got something you'd like to ask any of them, please do pop that into the chat window now because there'll be a couple of moments whilst we get the Q&A ready. So now we're moving on to our next set of 3 presentations. Another reminder that you can post your questions for the students into the chat window at any moment, and we will relay that to them during the next Q&A. So first up, we have Tammy Choi, who will be talking about design for disability and the importance of exploratory research for her design process.
Hello, my name is Tammy. Today I'm talking about design for disabilities. This is one of my projects in my final year. My first idea for the project is to design a VR experience for people with disabilities. This video gave me some inspirations. The video is about how VR helps people to improve their lives. Then I do some user research. I joined the Facebook group UK Willers and post my idea in the group to find some people to interview online. I got 6 people to volunteer to be interviewed. However, I messaged all of them, but I only got some responses. On the screen, you can see the posts I post in the group. I talk about where I study and I talk about what is my project about. In the comment is what people respond. I want to meet people in person and interview them. After I messaged some of them, I realized I wasn't thoughtful enough. Some people told me they have hearing problems, so they can't be interviewed through video calls. They have to be interviewed through message. I did not think about that before. I think I should be more thoughtful in the future. Then I start to do the user interview. I interviewed two girls, one called Michelle and another called Molly. In the interview, I asked them some questions and we chatted about them. I didn't plan what to do for the project until the interview helped me discover the real problems. In the interview, I asked them some questions. I asked them to introduce themselves, and I asked them about how did the Facebook group help them, and why they joined the group. I also asked them about is there anything they want to do or anywhere they want to go but restricted by their disabilities. The interviewer Molly said, I never finished my education because the school didn't seem interested in catering for my needs. She also told me people don't understand she've lost a lot of friends from getting sick and become disabled. And the interviewer Michelle told me the assistant from the station often don't turn up or turn up late or at the wrong platform. What she said gave me some inspiration for the project. I also see lots of people in the Facebook group have problems with the public transport. For example, another Facebook member said she could not get on the train because her wheelchair is too big for the train. She only found out that until she arrived at the station. Michelle also told me about how traveling is very complicated for her. She had to worry about how to transfer her wheelchair and won't break it, and also worried about how to book assistant and who can help her to go around places. I've never think about how traveling is such a difficult thing. I want to make a project that can help her and help other people with disabilities. I look on TfL's website, and on the website you can book the assistant. Passengers have to fill up a long form every time they want to book an assistant. The aim of the project is to make it easier for people with disabilities to book an assistant for the train and travel without worries. There are a few problems I heard from the interview and the Facebook group. The first one is people said it is too complicated to plan a travel. In the app, you can have your own account. Having your own account can save your time to enter your details again and again. In the beginning, you have to log into your account. Then you can choose to book assistance. You can choose where to departure and arrival. Then you choose which station you need assistance, and you can also add some additional requirements for the station, such as ramp or wheelchair. Then you can set up the meetup points where you want to meet the assistant. And then you can view the request. Then it's the countdown for the assistant. If you can't see your assistant, you can message them. Another problem I heard from an interviewer is the assistant from the station often don't turn up or turn up late or at the wrong platform. In the app, you can message the assistant. By messaging them, the passenger can find a meetup point faster. Then, after the assistant arrives, you can rate the service from the station. Another problem I have heard from the people is when the station is busy, it is more difficult for the staff to assist the passenger with disabilities. Receiving good reviews can encourage the staff at the station to be more willing to assist them. Ideally, the station which have the highest review can get some benefit. I have learned a lot from this project. For example, in the beginning, I didn't consider some people might have hearing problems. I think I should be more thoughtful in the future as a designer. Also, I didn't realize how many difficulties people with disabilities experience on their daily basis. I want to encourage others to be more conscious of other people's needs. I hope that this project can improve their life. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Tammy. And next up we have Will Cottrell, and he is going to give us a presentation that will reflect on his most recent project, which created a VR experience for first aid training, the importance of user research in validating your design decisions and the challenges of user testing under the conditions that we've been experiencing recently. Over to you, Will.
Understanding the user is a really important part of this project. So I'm going to be covering that in this part of the Behind the Interface talk. My name's Will Cottrell, and I will be talking about how it was important for me to understand user needs through thorough user research and user testing in my project. So just a little background on my project. My project was to look at the combination of virtual reality and first aid training. Scenario-based learning is a learning method and a teaching method that's often used in first aid training and other sort of associated vocational training like this. I also think that virtual reality has a really important place within this. So I thought it was, for this project, my final project, I decided I would look at any relationships, if there was a relationship, and should there be a relationship. But before I go into that, it's important that we understand the design process and how the design process informs how we conduct our user research and our user testing. So we often see this research, design, build, where people start with their research, they go on to design, and then they go on to build. And this is very common. For me, though, the project was weighted more like this, heavy research, less design and build. Of course, there was still a massive focus on those two, but research was super crucial to inform my decision making. So these are the two key areas and where they align on this sort of timeline of developing a minimum viable product. User research falls between the research and design process, and user testing falls after design and before we go on to building the product usually. Of course, it doesn't really look like that. It looks more like this. We're all over the place. This is very back and forth. This is how I do iterative design. You go back and forth between different elements and use them to inform your decision-making processes at different points. So, but it's also important to remember the timeline is important when we're dealing with user research, which needs to heavily inform the design, and then user testing, which then needs to heavily inform the final build of a product. So I made a series of assumptions in my project at the beginning, and I needed to justify these. So these assumptions were, the first one, users want virtual reality. Basically, what I mean by this is, does the user require virtual reality for the training or the task that they're trying to complete? And the next one is, current training needs improvement. This is an anecdotal thing from the first aid courses that I've done. Current training, I thought, needs to be improved, but is this the case with a larger set of people? Is that going to confirm my understanding of it? There are no current solutions that can do something similar to what my idea is, using virtual reality to teach people first aid. And then another assumption for an interface perspective is that virtual reality can be used for all aspects of the user interaction. And then, of course, because we're designers and UX designers, we like to think about interesting and innovative ways that people use interfaces and interact with them. So I made a series of assumptions about how I wanted the user to use an interface, and those are my sketches there for that. So I had these assumptions, I now had to justify them. So the first thing I did was I put out a questionnaire. The questionnaire, we went out to a set of 21 people from medical background and non-medical background, paramedics, non-paramedics, all that sort of thing. This questionnaire was really important as it informed my understanding of what people wanted from training. So the first assumption I made was VR needed. This was a bit shaky. Most people were unsure, and some people were like, yes, it would be amazing, but it depends on how the technology was deployed. My second assumption was did training need to be improved? And from my research, it came to the conclusion that it definitely did. There was room for improving it. So the questionnaire allowed me to really gather my information on user needs. This was real important part of my user research. I spent rather a long time formulating the questions and gathering information and analyzing it afterwards. So from the questionnaire, And to help me with my justification, I went on to do a one-to-one interview with one of the professionals that I had interviewed. They also had experience teaching in scenario-based learning environment, so I thought it was important to then do this interview with them. And we sat down for 2 hours. We came to the conclusion that virtual reality was super important, and it allowed me to answer this question: why VR? So why VR really needed to be answered, because without answering this, why even bother to continue with the project? So we came up with this sort of idea. So VR needed to be non-intrusive, easy to use, easy to set up, and provide a richer environment for learning. And with effective design, we can answer and do most of this. So that really does answer the question, why VR? If it is non-intrusive, improves current training, doesn't replace current training, is a complement to that, then I'm sure it will. And then in the justification, looking at current solutions. So of course there are current solutions that currently do similar things. So Oxford Medical Simulations is a great example of this. I use this to also justify that medical professional in general does want technology like this. So it was important for me to include this as a point. And then of course another justification was, were VR interfaces easy to use already? So I looked at a set of existing interfaces and went through those to explore them. So onto the design process, I put together, these are design images from my final project. This is a scenario and load screen. This allows someone to create a custom scenario quickly and randomly in the editor. This is for a student to practice and iterate. I then put together a simple menu system that a user could navigate around while in VR. I then also looked at the user interactions that needed to be required, such as feeling for a heart rate, checking a pulse, being able to understand what type of pulse it was. So with the haptic feedback in the controller, I was able to provide some depth of understanding to the user, which wouldn't have been achievable before. And I think this really adds to the immersive nature that VR can provide to training, the rich environment. Of course, when it came to performing my user testing on the product that I had, the prototype that I had put together with these interfaces and these user experiences, such as feeling for a heart rate, being able to hear the heart rate, and one of the key ones, which was voiceover narration to help the student navigate and learn in VR. So my key limitations were access to the technology. I had no access to VR. COVID impacted this. Virtual reality has a learning curve. Scope and project creep were important to consider, and time constraints. All these factors together really impacted how I approached my user testing. So my user testing consisted of video recording me doing prototyping and getting feedback from my peers on the course, and then also putting family members into the VR to see what they thought of it and what they think worked. And of course, this all had to happen within the time constraints of the project. So it was important that this happened quickly but effectively. And I made graphs and noted information down of what I had done. So this allowed me to solve the problems that appeared. And I could do those through iterative design. As I explained earlier on, there was a big portion of that. Things that I would do differently I would ensure that I could get effective, proper user testing from people who answered the questionnaire, allow them to use a VR interface, allow them to test, but of course with the COVID restrictions I couldn't. And then another key thing was the interface for the instructor. This is another important thing, the instructor-student relationship. With this, I had an instructor interface which would be separate to the virtual reality interface, which I originally designed everything to be in VR. This wasn't necessarily the best experience, so I went around and changed that and developed some tablet interfaces that would interact with the student in VR. Anyway, thank you for that. This is going to be a little quick VR demo of what I put together.
Welcome to this scenario. In this scenario, you will learn the basics of first aid, from assessing a situation, checking for dangers, to cleaning wounds and wrapping bandages. But first you need to understand the primary survey. Walk into the office and follow the prompts to learn the basics of the primary survey. Okay, you're in the office. What do you see?
I see a casualty lying on the floor. And that's all I see.
Next, we need to check for a response from the casualty. Call out to see if they can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me? Excuse me, sir, can you hear me?
The casualty didn't respond to verbal communications. Next, see if they respond to touch. If they don't respond to touch, we can try a pain reaction, such
Hello,
as
sir,
pinching
can
the
you hear me?
casualty for a response.
Excuse me, sir, can you hear me? There's no response. Let me check, see if there's a pulse. He looks like he's breathing, so...
It appears the casualty is breathing. We need to assess the casualty for any other injuries. You should have been taught how to assess a casualty by your instructor. Perform the rest of the primary survey. An important indicator that we can check on the casualty is their heart rate. Find the carotid artery and check for a pulse.
There we go.
Okay, we have an understanding of the casualty situation and it appears that they have passed out. Place the casualty in the recovery position and go for help.
Okay, so he's got about 10 beats in 10 seconds, so that's about 50, just over 50 beats. Yeah, so 50 beats per minute. He looks like he's breathing all right. Okay, listening. Okay,
You've
cool.
completed the introduction to the primary survey. The scenario is now complete.
Thank you, Will. And a reminder to everyone that after the next presentation, there's going to be a Q&A. So if you've got any questions you'd like to pose to Tammy or Will about their work, then please do put it into the chat box. And finally, we have Fisnik's presentation. Fisnik designed and built an interface to support his thesis, which was on the subject of AAC devices, which are augmentative and alternative communication interfaces specifically designed for those with speech impediments and disabilities. I'll pass you over to Fisnik now.
My name is Fisnik. The project I will be discussing is my thesis research project I completed at the beginning of this year. For this research project, I explored the alternative communication techniques used by children with speech impairments and disabilities, specifically those on the autism spectrum disorder. The research question I was aiming to answer was, how can user interface and experience design aid the development of good communication through augmentative and alternative communication AAC devices? For this project, I explored the relationship between user interface, user experience design, and AAC interfaces for individuals with speech impairments and disabilities. I explored how AAC is used by individuals who suffer from a cognitive intellectual disability and tried to understand how designers can design these interfaces to help the user develop their good communication. Another area I explored was how code can help to remove the constraints found in existing speech supplementation methods. It was important to identify what good communication was. I did this through a couple of interviews I conducted. First, I interviewed Kate Sneedon, a speech and language therapist from the Bridge School Trust in North London. Kate explained that there is a three-step communication process they aim to teach pupils at the Bridge. This process is as follows. First, the pupil chooses their subject. This is the person they are wanting to communicate with. For example, in a home setting, this could be their parents' carers. At school, this could be their teacher. When their child is out in the community, this could be a shopkeeper. The second step in the process is selecting the verb, such as I want or I feel. The third step is picking the object word, the actual thing the pupil is asking for. For example, if the pupil is asking to go to lunch or at school, or if they are communicating feeling, this object word could be happy, worried, angry. When the pupil uses this three-step process, the result is a phrase such as, "Teacher, I want lunch hall." And whilst in some cases this output may not sound like a coherent sentence, this is not what was being aimed for. This is the process of good communication the bridge aimed to teach their pupils, and with it identified, I continue to explore the existing systems used in the classroom and at home to judge how well they allowed the child to follow this three-step process. A speech supplementation method used by the bridge was Picture Exchange Communication System, PECS. This is a method where individuals use laminated pieces of paper with symbols printed on them to communicate. The speaker can browse through a ring of symbols or browse through a communication symbol dossier. They can pass or point to a symbol from a Velcro board attached to the wall so the listener can understand their needs. These PECS techniques represent current low-tech systems used in the classroom and at home. In my thesis, I highlight the practicality issues surrounding them, such as they may only be available at school. Speakers may not be able to take them home, therefore they can't communicate efficiently when at home. Transporting binders represents practical issues, especially when the speaker communicates with an unfamiliar listener. They may be reluctant to wait for the speaker to flick through a binder. Furthermore, these methods allow the user to skip through the process of good communication, going straight to the object symbols. Speech and language therapist Sneeden expressed this was the case at the Bridge School, and that it was extremely difficult to get the pupils to first point to the symbol of the subject, then the verb, and finally the object. I then interviewed AAC coordinator, speech and language therapist Laura Duffy from Blossom House School, where I accumulated knowledge on what is expected from a good AAC system. The main point Duffy argued was that AAC systems should allow repairing an interaction that's gone wrong. This is an extremely important issue in AAC systems that should be addressed, as it often occurs, which can lead to frustrations in the speaker, which needs to be avoided at all costs in order to ensure positive listener attitudes. Ensuring positive listener attitudes heavily relies on the competence of the listener and their willingness to give the speaker the time they need to get their communication across. This is impacted severely when the communication technique is not practical and easy to understand by the listener. Therefore, listeners' attitudes may be impacted when using low-tech methods such as PECS, even if the AAC system doesn't require the listener to do most of the work. Ways in which positive listener attitudes could be achieved is by improving sentence structure and using verbal prompts. Whilst most AAC systems already use audio to play selected words and phrases, current systems fail when it comes to improving sentence structure, therefore falling short of Duffy's first main request from a good system. Current designs do not constrict the user from selecting the final object word, meaning the user could immediately tap on that word. For example, tapping on what sits randomly without any context would be an issue, especially to an unfamiliar listener. The speaker would need to be forced through a process to get to the what's it symbol, therefore providing the context. At each stage, a verbal prompt could play, such as shopkeeper, I want what's its. Duffy also expressed frustration with the app used by her students. The visual design incorporated a packed grid system which flooded the landing page. The first thing the speaker would see are rows and columns filled with symbols and words, as this image shows. This can be quite intimidating. A good AAC system would need to take into consideration the listener's thoughts upon seeing such a cluttered interface, which means designers must understand the needs of both users, the speaker and the listener, to ensure AAC is effective. My outcome is a coded and interactive progressive web app. I took a tablet-first approach, ensuring the design worked well when loaded on the iPad. However, later made the code responsive for mobile, as there were many more use cases the user would need the interface to work on a mobile device rather than a tablet. For example, when a class with speech-impaired individuals goes on an outing, carrying each child's communication symbols and booklets may be unfeasible. But if each child had their own web link with their personalized AAC interface, all the teacher would need is a smartphone with an internet connection. My visual design is a grid layout which doesn't compact the symbols. They take up more room than a traditional AAC system, as my intentions weren't to cramp everything above the fold line. Color is used to distinguish between the different sections of the interface as the user is progressing through the three-step good communication process. Now I will walk you through the good communication process through my interface design. In tablet mode, only the subject symbols are initially visible. The user must select a subject, and when they do, the interface will react by showing the next step of the communication process. In mobile mode, the whole screen is filled with this one step, as is the same for the rest of the steps in the communication process. Now that the subject has been selected, the verb column is visible. This includes symbols the speaker may need quick access to, symbols that may be used alone, such as when asking for a break, or rejecting something by tapping on the no symbol. The object column, which displays all the object words the user can select to complete their communication, appears only after the user selects I want or I do from the verb column. My AAC system design is currently being used by children with autism to improve their communication process and communicate whether out and about at home or at school. If you'd like to try my AAC interface, you can scan the QR code on screen, and please feel free to connect with me on my socials. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Fizz. That was really good. Excellent presentations from everybody. Very proud to have such a diverse set of projects and all really well researched, very interesting topics. And this has been a great opportunity for them all to dive into some of the details which you don't often get to see when you're just looking at the veneer of the interface. Anybody who has enjoyed the talks and would like to have a discussion with the students, please do join us. But as a summary, I just want to say thank you so much to all of the 6 presenters who have really shown some of the aspects of their practice that we get to see as staff, but aren't always easy to see through the outcomes from their projects. And the 6 projects have been super diverse and extraordinarily interesting. And I do hope that you've all enjoyed them as well. So thanks again to the viewers, and thanks again to Oliver, who's been tirelessly working behind the scenes for that, for us as well. There's his hand. And so for the 6 students, also we'll post a link for you to come and join us in the breakout room. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.